This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. I want to thank my latest reviewer on podchaser.com. Hello to Ruth, all the way in Botswana. Thank you so much, Ruth, for listening and for reviewing the podcast. You can review the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store or on podchaser.com. And subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's show. On to today's show. My guest today is Michael Marvosh. Michael is the host of the Dead Man's Forest podcast, which is hard to describe other than an ASMR think piece out in nature, out in the forest. Michael is working on a book about having conversations that matter, and this is a conversation that matters. This conversation is fairly wide-ranging. We talk about his deconversion, which he later says is not really a deconversion. We talk about his rediscovery of spirituality, for lack of a better term. Please don't let that scare you. We talk a lot about the definitions of these words, like spirituality, like soul, and trying to reinterpret them in a natural and human way. What we mean by them is something deep and profound, and you're going to hear that in Michael's description of his experiences. The number one thing you're going to hear is Michael's voracious curiosity. He spends a little bit of time asking me about what I describe as secular grace and humanism. So this is a bit more of a back and forth. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that you do too. Here is my conversation that matters with Michael Marvosh. Michael Marvosh, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you, David. It's so good to be here.
Michael, I really appreciate that you reached out to me. We've actually had one conversation before. Mm-hmm. I think you have some really interesting insights into humanity, into this thing we call spirituality, or don't call this thing spirituality, which we will get into. One of the things that intrigued me the most when you first reached out to me was you said you have a deconversion story that you no longer think of as a deconversion story. So let's begin with that. What was your faith experience like, and then what happened?
Okay. Yeah, I think the reason I said that is specifically in reference to the use of the term deconversion. So I'm going to highlight that right now and then say, let's come back to that later.
Okay, sure.
In how we use the word deconversion. But my deconversion story, I was raised Lutheran by a pretty conservative, loving family. Mm-hmm. I was Lutheran for the first 21 or so years of my life. We went to church every Sunday. I went to Sunday school. I went to vacation Bible school. I went to church camp. My parents were good enough to put me through Lutheran schools starting from third grade. So, I went to chapel once a week. I think it was once a week, all through grade school. Okay. Went to a Lutheran high school. And so got religion classes in high school. And then I even opted to go to a Lutheran college, out of state. So I did escape the gravity a little bit on my own. And that's probably part of what resulted in my deconversion, junior year of college. All in all, I would say I had a pretty beneficent experience with religion, mm-hmm. growing up in it. I think that as religions go, Lutheranism is one of the ones that does a pretty good job of not unnecessarily saddling you with guilt, right, or judgment or hellfire and brimstone and all of those things. So religion to me was never an unpleasant thing. It was never something that made me feel judged. I was never living my life in fear and guilt and shame. And so I am in large part still grateful for my upbringing. Mm-hmm. The reason that I stopped being a Christian is because I got to the point where I think I was in a book or a class in college where we were studying the Book of Concord. And we're just diving really deep into the theology, and I just started having some thoughts and analyzing things, as I tend to do,
Yeah.
that just made me realize that the theology of Lutheranism, less specifically Christianity, and a few years later, all religions, just were internally self-contradictory. There was no way that I saw that they could be logically true. And I'll go into that in some detail, but first I wanted to ask you something, because I've been thinking about this conversation
Sure.
and how I would tell this story. And I listened to your conversation with David Helston.
Yes.
And that was such an interesting conversation. And you it sounded like you expressed to him that your experience of deconversion, and a lot of the people that you talked to, was one of looking at the evidence of Jesus' life and death and saying that there wasn't enough evidence there to accept that as kind of a pillar of the way that you create meaning or create understanding of the meaning of the universe. Is that an accurate description?
I think I would frame it slightly different. For me personally, I admit that I am a fundamentalist on that one issue, that the resurrection, the crucifixion and resurrection must be literal for Christianity to make any sense whatsoever. Yes. And as a believer, I absolutely, I joke, I held on to it like a pearl of great price. That was the thing. That was the last thing to go as I was, without knowing what the word deconstruction is, the process of just becoming less fundamentalist over time. That was the last thing to go. And for me, when I kept saying to myself internally, someone else must have better evidence somewhere. Someone else must have better explanation somewhere than I've seen. And when I actually went to go look for that, I was shocked at the lack of evidence. And I want to be very careful with my terminology here, because believers, theists, Christians in particular, will often say that atheists straw man by saying there is no evidence. Yes. And I want to be clear here that the historical record, such as it is, what we have is not no evidence.
Yeah.
But what my challenge is that for the enormity of the claim, we are saying that this was a unique event in history that is the most, from the Christian perspective, the most important event in history. The paltry nature, the circumstantial, oral tradition come to text nature is not sufficient for that intensity of a claim.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Right. That's the I don't know. I can't remember the word exactly of the cliche, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Exactly. That's actually straight out of Carl Sagan's.
Got it.
What is it? A Demon Haunted World, which I'm currently reading. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, so the reasons that I mentioned before get, I think, directly at what you're talking about from a different perspective.
Okay.
And I'm going to summarize them by saying this. What occurred to me my junior year of college is that even if Jesus did die and rise from the dead, that's still not good enough.
Okay.
And I'll walk you through that. I'll walk you through, the logic that I came up with. I don't think I've ever heard anyone else express this argument in the last 16 years or so since it occurred to me. And it's this. So according to the Christian tradition, our nature as human beings is fallen. And that was the occurrence in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. They were created by God. They were perfect, presumably deathless. They presumably didn't suffer. And what happened when they sinned is God came down into the garden and he said, now you will suffer. You will live by the sweat of your brow, and the woman will suffer pains in childbirth. And so one of the consequences of our sin is that we suffer. Later in the Bible, somewhere in the New Testament, we have the pretty famous verse that the wages of sin is death.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can make a reasonable assumption that Adam and Eve, had they not fallen into original sin, would not have died, would have, maybe gotten taken directly to live with God in heaven. And so because we sin, we suffer, and because we sin, we die. Third consequence of sin that we see is the eternal separation from God that we call hell sometimes. And that is because we're just not good enough to be with him.
Mm-hmm.
We're just such miserable creatures that we can't,
Yes.
When we die, if we're not saved, then we live forever without him. So those are the three consequences of sin that the Bible and Christian theology lays out.
Yeah.
Now, before I talk about Jesus, I need to talk about the notion of sacrifice. So sacrifice is a very old notion. I think it's a very human notion and not necessarily a religious one.
I would
we
agree.
see it in the Old Testament with, the scapegoat, the sending out of the goat into the desert, where we kind of ritually cast the sins of the people onto it, and then we send it out, and presumably it dies, and therefore, again, presumably buys us a few more months of life,
Yes.
of not being destroyed by a vengeful God. And so the whole notion of a sacrifice is that what we deserve is deferred by placing the consequences of it onto someone or something else.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Jesus is seen as the perfect sacrifice. And so unlike the goat who, buys us a few months, Jesus sacrifice buys us an eternity,
right,
of freedom from the consequences of our sin. Okay? We've established that there's three consequences to our sin: suffering, death, and eternal damnation. So we need to look at the possible effect of Jesus' sacrifice on each of those three things. Okay? 1, suffering. Jesus suffered a lot. That's a big part of the story.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay? But obviously, you and I still suffer, as does every human. So it does not seem that Jesus' suffering was sufficient to take away that consequence of our sin.
Yes.
We still suffer. Second consequence of sin is death. You and I are still going to die.
Yep.
Everybody we know is going to die. Everybody that has ever lived that we know of has died.
Yes.
So it does not seem that Jesus' death was sufficient to take away the eventual reality of our own death.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? The only consequence of sin remaining is eternal damnation. And again, we've established that the notion of a sacrifice is somebody taking your place. So it seems to me that in order for Jesus' sacrifice to have been sufficient to pay for our eternal damnation, he would have had to have been eternally damned, but he wasn't.
Right.
He died. He went to hell for 3 days, presumably to say that word, presumably to declare his victory over Satan, and then ascended back into heaven. But if he wasn't eternally damned, then where was the sacrifice? Where did our eternal damnation go? The only possible conclusion is that, God just snapped his fingers and made it disappear. And if that's what God does, then God could save everybody if he wanted to.
Yes. Yeah. I do want to be fair here, because I can hear the theologians listening just jumping up and down right now about all the sophisticated soteriology, expiation, all those very sophisticated theological concepts about what God has done with our sin through Jesus. But you make an excellent point. If God can just take care of it, he could do so for all of humanity for all time.
Yeah. And I would be happy to talk about those things, because again, this occurred to me 14 years ago. I spent probably the next 8 or 9 or 10 years of my life just kind of being religiously numb and just not thinking about it and just going through the motions and doing things. And that's an important part of the story, but it's not necessarily an interesting part of the story.
Actually, I think it is. I think that probably represents a very large population of people.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's not interesting to go into the details of, just doing ordinary human life. Is what I mean.
Okay.
Um, it's very everyday. But I am interested, now that I have temporal and emotional distance from that significant change in my life. And I've had one thing that occurred to me in listening to your other interviews and in thinking about my own deconversion experience um, is that for you and me and a lot of other people that you've talked to, faith was very important. It was
Mm-hmm.
foundational to how we oriented ourselves to reality. And it's like, I think of it as being kind of this chain that is connected to some part of your being that would refer to as the soul, and that like just gives you something to hang on to instead of being adrift. But that chain is like hooked into us with
Yeah.
like claws, and it's very much like ripping it out, that deconversion process, and it leaves deep emotional and spiritual wounds in us. And so much of what I think you are working to help people with is to see that and to kind of clean up the wound and accept it for what it is, and then just let time heal things as it does, which is what we can hope for
Yeah.
for for anyone, religious or not, just human beings in general.
The main thing for me is I think each of us goes through this process alone. There are a few lucky people who have, a good friend who is either secular or who has gone through this similar process. But most people go through it alone, feeling like I'm the only one who's ever felt this. I'm not a good Christian. I'm not doing the right things. I'm not praying hard enough. I'm not, tithing enough, what have you. Whatever your faith tradition is that says what a good Christian is, you blame yourself.
Right.
Then you come out of it. You feel released from that. And then that feels like a unique experience. I'm the only one who's ever experienced this.
Yeah.
And you have this deep need, or I did. I'll speak personally. I had this deep need to tell that story, to put that out in the world. And there were a handful of places to do that, but that was something very early on. I realized that that's what I can contribute, is be that place for people to tell that story.
Yeah. And yeah, as I said in an email that I sent you, I honor your courage. I think it's really remarkable that you move through the world with so much courage regarding the vulnerability that you experienced, and that's great.
Thank
Keep
you.
up the good work.
Yeah, I'll try.
Yeah, and to continue the story and to maybe get to the tease of the mention of deconversion. Like I said, I spent the next decade or so just kind of doing things, working jobs and making friends and hanging out and buying a house and all of those things, and not thinking about it too much, just keeping myself entertained. And I don't know if I can say exactly what the experience I had that kind of made me start thinking about spirituality again was. As far back as I can remember, I have always been very keenly aware of transience and death, and
Mm-hmm.
and I have kind of a low level background sadness about that
Okay.
all the time. It's
Yeah.
it's just it's not bad. It's not depression. It's just a recognition that this moment is very poignant in that it's never going to come again, and it's the only one that's ever going to be like this.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something, I don't know what about that. I would use the term magical if I believed in magic.
Right. Right.
But looking back now on whatever it was that started to awaken me, and having listened to your podcast and done a lot of reading over the last years and a lot of thinking and trying to have every conversation that I can with people who are interested in talking about these things,
Yeah.
I have come back to the term spirituality and tried to get a perspective on it that makes sense from my current understanding of reality
Mm-hmm.
and what it is and how it functions. And to me, it spirituality, what I call spirituality, has the same flavor as, and I'll go ahead and use a religious metaphor, as Moses approaching God on the mountain and taking off his sandals because he was on holy ground.
Mm-hmm.
Reality is bigger than anything we can understand. And we know so little about so many things. And, the caveat to that is that we do know a lot, and we know a lot more than we used to know, but
Right.
there is basically an infinity of stuff that we still have left to discover about why we're here and where we came from and where anything came from and how it's all working. And even about ourselves, right? When you look deep into yourself, you realize I don't understand myself. There's who knows how much about me that is still a mystery to me.
Right.
And so there is this aspect to reality of our place in it, which is a very small, very limited, and we are in relationship somehow with this vast thing that seems to really exist that we call reality. And so the term spirituality I just used to describe that relationship, of we are small, reality is big, and there's a lot of stuff that we don't know. And it seems like the rightful response to that is awe and humility and curiosity. And those are all characteristics of spirituality to me.
Mm-hmm.
And they're
Mm-hmm.
very human things. They're not, I don't think they're religious things, but I think that the stories and the words and the ideas that religions are using are trying to point to those same things. They're trying to point to the real reality that I believe exists and that I believe that you believe exists.
Mm-hmm.
And they're what the religions I think are doing is mistaking the stories about what's going on for what's actually going on.
Right. No, I think that's a great observation. You very astutely pointed out that we often talk about the definitions of words and that that's important. And so I want to just highlight here what attracts you and I to each other is that we are both struggling to define the word spirituality, right? Like there's certainly a segment of particularly the atheists, the people who would identify as atheists, which I include myself as, who would run screaming from that word.
Right.
And yet it is conveying something. It's conveying something about the human natural experience. And so you referred to the word soul earlier. I find that word very useful. When I talk about my soul, I mean the deepest part of who I am, myself.
Yeah.
And you can't go around explaining that to everyone. I don't mean something supernatural here. I mean,
yes.
But for my audience, as you are listening, for me, anytime I use those words, I mean them in the most human aspect possible, right?
Yeah, and I think the thing that occurred to me that I wanted to say during our conversation that I hope will be helpful to people is that I think when any healthy person, whatever they believe, when any healthy person is talking about what they believe, is talking about their experience, they are trying to point at something real.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not they're using the term God or soul or spirituality, it has been so helpful to me to just assume that people are trying to speak about reality, trying to speak about their experience of reality. And that helps me interpret whatever words people are using, because words are only symbols to point at an experience that exists solely in, my own head and solely in your own head. And we're trying to compare those things. And it's crazy that we're able to do that at all.
Right.
And it's very difficult. And religion is, I think, in most cases, a good faith attempt to try to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to expand on the original thought of mistaking the story for the reality. There's a number of analogies for this, right? the map is not the terrain. You'll hear people say, right? Like the model is not reality. It may be useful, but it's not going to be accurate, right? Like there's just a ton of secular or natural comparisons here.
Mm-hmm.
And my favorite definition of religion in the non-supernatural sense is Anthony Pinn saying it's just a collective search for meaning.
Yeah.
And I think you've just nailed the thing that causes, if I can use the word suffering, but the pain and ultimately leads to someone deconverting.
Yes.
Is having mistaken the story for reality and experiencing in some way the disparity between those two.
Yes. Yes, because they've been told the story is real, and then they have an experience or a realization or something that suggests to them that no, the real is ever so much bigger than the story.
Mm.
And we can't really describe it that well because it's just so big.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just so everything.
Right.
And yeah, and I think that is a very astute, you use the word astute, description. So thank you for noticing that. What I was thinking of saying in response to that is one thing that I have realized recently that I'm trying to notice more frequently is that stories and our human use of them, I think, goes almost all the way down to the very core of our being.
Mm.
I think that maybe, if not all, then almost every thought that we can have is some rudimentary story. Even from, I wrote about this in the book that I'm working on, even our very first word, which was probably mama, is an encapsulation of reality and a delineation between this thing in reality and that thing in reality, which, we could speculate that a baby doesn't have the mental complexity to do much division of reality up into this and that, and just kind of accepts everything is happening to me.
Right.
Which is why they're so happy and so sad and so all over the place. But that word mama is a remarkable piece of phenotypic technology, I would say, that human beings developed at some point in the past. And you and I, and all of the rest of humanity that exists at this moment are the recipients of an amazingly high fidelity language that we can use to describe reality.
Absolutely.
That earlier humans didn't possess, at least to this degree, and which is still utterly not up to the task.
Yes.
You can't describe the territory,
right,
except with something as complicated as the entire territory itself.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I didn't expect us to get to these subjects, but I find this fascinating. Like we're going to jump the rails here a bit, but there's a lot of discussion in philosophy about, like, Nick Bostrom's theory that we may live in a simulation. And the conceit that I'm dubious of in that is that a simulation of the sophistication of our experience of the physical reality we live in can be compressed in something smaller than the size of the known universe.
Yes. Yeah.
and again, I'm way out of my, over my skis here as far as my own personal knowledge in this area, but it may take the size of the known universe in a quantum field that big to generate the reality that we live in. And there's and nobody has ever proven that we can compress that to some smaller degree.
Sure. Yeah.
And just one more thought, and then I'll let you respond to these. And the other is what you've described there about even a baby having, a story, this experience of language. And it's helpful to contrast that to, like, AI, right? Some people are just astonished by where we are with AI. And I'm always thinking, Yeah. Like, and what I mean by that is you can show, you teach a child, let's say a 2 or 3 year old, this is a kitty. And they see a real cat in real life and they see a cartoon cat and you can draw, two little ears and two dots and a little nose and they'll recognize that as a cat. An AI has no idea what a cat is. And you can show them all of these pictures. You have to train it to
Yes.
figure out. And even
Yes.
then, it doesn't understand what a cat is. It has no story of what catness is. It just has previous experiences of that, right?
Yeah.
Whereas even a 3-year-old is imagining playing with a cat, is imagining cats that don't exist. Is it, you know what I mean? That's a whole nother level of experience.
Yes. Yeah. What you are talking about reminds me of a book I read in the last year or two by David Deutsch called The Beginning of
Ah,
Infinity.
yeah. Yes, I have read that.
And he mentions in that he thinks that in order for us to have true AI, we first need to understand why qualia
Mm-hmm.
exists. I wasn't familiar with the term qualia, but qualia is a word that describes why our experience is the way it is. So why does the color green look green to us? You
Right.
can't explain that to somebody. You
Right.
just have to experience it.
Yes. Yeah.
And yes, he thinks until we understand why qualia is the way it is, we won't be able to create a true artificial intelligence. And he's optimistic. He thinks we're close to that, and I can't imagine that we're close to understanding
Yes.
that.
Yeah, a little bit more on this, and then we'll move off. I don't want to bore everyone, but like we are, neuroscience and the study of what is intelligence. Even we are using our brain to try to understand what our brain is doing, right? And there's so many levels of recursion going on
Yes.
there that it's very very challenging. I want
Yeah.
to put a bow on this and say the idea that you are expressing is the correct response to the complexity and the vastness of life is humility, is epistemic
Yeah.
humility. Barrett Evans' book, he quotes someone else who I'm afraid I don't remember, but they said, we live in a vast ocean of ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as we do know, there is so much that we do not know. And so, in particular, when we have a worldview, we accept a particular story to explain the vast complexity of life.
Yeah.
We have to hold that lightly so that when experience or evidence or argumentation or what have you comes along that counters a deeply held belief like that we have to be willing to at least analyze it, at least look at it and judge it based on its merits.
Yes. Yeah. And this gets at the arguments that I've heard people like Jordan Peterson make. There is survival value in that humility for us. There and we are in some ways fragile when we forget that humility and we get too big for our britches, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, but sure, we can move the conversation on, and I'm going to actually do it by linking back to somebody you mentioned earlier,
Okay.
Nick Bostrom, about the simulation,
Yeah.
the likelihood of us living in a simulation. I think that's fascinating to think about, but I don't think it's necessarily helpful to think about in trying to figure out how to live a meaningful life or a life that
Mhm.
you feel like is worth living, because it gets so far down the road from our own experience, which is really at the core of who we are. And this gets to what you mentioned earlier, another one of those religious terms, soul. I have found it very helpful to try to be as to try to pay as close attention as I can to my experience of experiencing,
Mhm. Yeah.
because that seems to be the most direct connection I have with the reality that I live in. It's not the stories. If I can just let go of the stories even for a minute and just experience, then that seems to be the core of who I am. All of
Mhm.
those stories I have, all of the thoughts, they come into my awareness in the frame of that experience, of that consciousness. And so that's my feeling about what a soul is.
Mm-hmm.
It's just my deepest level of awareness of existing.
We kind of jumped ahead and we've been quite abstract here and philosophical. I want to come back to your story. So,
Okay.
your rediscovery of these ideas of spirituality, you went through what you called a vision quest. You want to tell us that story?
Yeah, let me think. What's going to be a helpful way to go through this? Okay. Yeah, I did a vision quest, and my it's not something that I would have ever thought of doing when I
Mm-hmm.
was younger.
Okay.
I really kind of stumbled across it serendipitously, after all those years of just working jobs and having what I feel like was living my life on pause, so to speak. I got a job with a Silicon Valley tech startup, which was very challenging and energizing and caused me to grow a lot in my own recognition of my abilities as a worker. And after that startup failed and I got laid off, I wanted to do more work that felt like my own,
Mm-hmm.
that
Okay.
felt meaningful, that it was my way of using the unique skills that I possess. And so I became an entrepreneur. I use the term became there a little bit lightly.
Okay.
I started trying to learn how to be an entrepreneur, and I went to all the conferences and I did a lot of what we might call networking, but since I like talking to people, it was really just having conversations,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
trying to get everybody that would agree to have a beer with me to go talk to me for an hour,
Sure.
and
Sure.
ask them about their experience and how they did this thing. And one of the women that I spoke with was a facilitator a of the local chapter of an organization which is very vaguely called death cafes,
Okay.
which immediately resonated with that part of myself that I mentioned earlier, that kind of
Right.
low level awareness of transience that I have. And I was really curious about how she got death cafes up and running, because I went to one and it was 40 people and they get together and they drink tea and they eat cookies and they talk about death.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is not something that you would think people would be excited about. But it was
Right.
really successful.
Right.
And I wanted to know how she did that. And the answer to that question wasn't particularly interesting, because I found out it was just a big organization who
Mm.
found that there's a deep human need to talk about these existential things, and if you
Right.
give people the space to do it, they will do it enthusiastically. And
Yeah.
to your listeners, if you have a chance to go to a local death cafe, I entirely encourage it. It is not depressing. There is sadness and there is
Right.
tears and there is honesty, but you will see a beautiful side of humanity in those things.
I think both as Westerners and even within religious contexts, we often aren't allowed to talk about death as it actually is. We have euphemisms for it. We
Right.
have explanations within religions that you're going to be with your loved ones again and someday, and so just facing the reality of
Yeah.
one's humanity and that will come to an end, and the loss of loved ones is just doing that in some real and honest way is deeply, deeply important. So,
Yeah, it is. It is. And it also, I think, helps to recognize that, like you and I were talking about earlier, our concept of death too is a story. We don't know what it is.
mhm.
Like, what's it going to be like to be dead? I don't know. Nobody does.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, she talked about how she came to the realization that that was the work that she should be doing. She also did work with helping people. I don't think she called herself a death doula, which is which is a career out there.
Okay.
But she does work with people in creating death masks, which is, an art form that kind of represents their own wrestling with their own mortality.
Hmm.
And she mentioned that she had done a vision quest, and this is where she realized that this was the work she was meant to do. And as soon as she mentioned that, it was like a deep chord was struck in me, and and something just kind of came awake. I think I even shed a tear or two, just sitting in the coffee
Yeah.
shop with this
Sure.
woman I had just met.
Yeah.
I was like, wow. And that, as you can probably tell, I'm a pretty intellectual person, and I don't know if I don't think when I was younger I was kind of emotionally shut down. In hindsight, I think it probably happened, based on some romantic relationships in college and based on losing my faith and just kind of having to numb myself to the emotional pain that I was in based on those things.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, a few years ago, like when I was learning to be an entrepreneur, you really do have to look at yourself a lot in order to learn how you move through the world. And so I guess I was just ready to hear some of those things. And that resonated with me so powerfully that I signed up to do a vision quest. And I think it was 8 months later that I was, you know, in the desert in Death Valley by myself for four
Wow.
days, not eating, sitting on the side of a mountain with, nothing but 2 gallons of water and a sleeping pad.
Man. Wow. Okay.
And I mean, the organization that I did my vision quest with is called the School of Lost Sporters. I think they are remarkable people. I think they do remarkable work. If this resonates with any of your listeners, I wholeheartedly recommend they look into that. It was such an amazing growth opportunity. The 12 or so people that were there to do it's a group of people, and you spend 3 or 4 days kind of getting ready, and then you spend
Mm-hmm.
4 days by yourself fasting, and then you spend 3 days decompressing and talking about what you experienced.
Okay.
So the group of people that we did that with are still friends. We still email regularly. We have a great deal of love for each other, and it's an interesting relationship because we don't really know each other that well. We,
Right.
we were together for 12 days, and
Yeah.
yet we all went there to be open with ourselves and each other about who we wanted to be in the future, about who we wanted to become, who we wanted to grow into. And that's really what those 4 days at the beginning and the 3 days at the end are. They're to develop your intention.
Okay.
You go into a vision quest with an intention. It's a statement of who you want to be when you return.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And my intention was it revolved around getting back in touch with the emotional side of myself so that I could be a whole person. I could probably tell you exactly what my intention was. I am an integrated person who gives all of the parts of himself an equal seat at the table so that I can share my gift of words with the world. That's what it was.
Mm. Okay.
And it's not like, it's not, a vision quest is not like lights coming down from heaven or hallucinating or things like that. It's, if you want to talk about the individual experiences out there, it's really just a lot of sitting around and trying to pay attention to what's going on inside of
Right.
yourself and
Right.
what's going on in the natural world. It's really mostly boring.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say, I imagine that most of it
Yeah.
is boring, and then the extremes of fasting and just 4 days by yourself probably just makes everything super bright color.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it wasn't even as much that as I expected it to be. I
Mm.
didn't feel weak. I didn't feel slow-witted. I didn't feel tired. I thought that I would, but really I felt pretty normal after the hunger pangs go away, after the first day and a half or so. But really, it's just, I think for me, it was forcing myself to sit with myself and notice who I was and make some come to some agreements with myself about how I wanted to move through the world in the future. And in large part, just deciding to do it is the biggest thing, because you're demonstrating to yourself that you care enough about changing to do this pretty crazy thing.
Right.
You're paying a high cost. It gets back to what we talked about earlier. It's like a sacrifice,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is an important human concept to becoming who we want to become. And it's not like I'm perfectly in touch with the emotional side. Nobody is one thing all the time,
Right.
but it's definitely a regular part of my existence today.
Mm-hmm.
And I just feel like I want to say I feel like a more complete person. I'm a little worried that that sounds cliche, but I I can accept who I am even when I'm not exactly how I want to be. I can say, well, this is who I am today, and there's no point in chafing at that. The only thing I can do is try to be more who I want to be tomorrow.
Mm.
That's all any of us can do.
You're learning to give yourself grace.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's so important. And I've never been what I think of as a hustler. This was one
Mm-hmm.
of the things I learned when I was talking to all those entrepreneurs. There's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who feel like they need to light a fire under their ass, right? Go, go,
Yeah.
go all the time. And that's how you succeed. And I've never been that way, because I like to look at things and I like to think about things, and that takes time. But maybe this works for some people. One of the big takeaways I got from your conversation with Bart Campolo was that everybody has a different path.
Yeah.
And for me, the path to becoming more of the person I want to be was through accepting the person I am,
Hmm.
as strange as that may seem.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting you brought up the conversation with Bart, because I think something that I'm learning is we have that, or I have this drive sometimes to explain things.
Mm-hmm.
And my conversation with Bart, I was trying to say, hey, human beings have these deep hardwired needs for connection and belonging and awe and that kind of thing. And it's a simplistic story. And Bart was really challenging me, saying, yeah, but not everyone. And so the point I want to make here is, like, if for the listener, if you're listening, you think, wow, a Vision Quest sounds amazing. That's great. And if you're listening, you're thinking that sounds crazy. That's okay
That's
too, right?
okay.
This was deeply meaningful for Michael.
Yes.
It might not be for you. A part of this discovery, especially post deconversion, is I get to discover what is meaningful to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be a little trial and error. You might work at that for a while, but you'll find things that develop meaning in your life. And you are a unique human being, and you might be radically different than the person sitting next to you.
Yes. Yeah. I try not to give advice, because I have learned over the years that advice is often selfish, or
Mm-hmm.
given for
Yeah. Yeah.
selfish reasons, perhaps. But along the lines of what you were just saying to the listeners, David, I think the thing that really clicked for me is that I noticed something inside myself shift when I felt Joyce mention the Vision Quest. And in order
Mm-hmm.
to notice those things, you have to pay attention to your own experience. You have to look into yourself and learn what's going on in there. Because I think this is one of the things I wanted to talk about. I feel like we, as rational people who often end up as atheists or deconverts or whatever, we think of reality as being out there, and it is, but it's also in us.
Mm.
We are a part of reality.
Right.
There is reality in us, and we can look inside for valuable clues about who we are and how we ought to be, and how we feel about certain things. And that's really important information to being the person you want to be. How can you be the person you want to be if you don't know who you want to be.
Right, right, right. Is that formalized? I know a lot of, like, it's very trendy right now to do various forms of meditation or mindfulness. Is that something that's formal for you in that way?
No, I don't. I don't meditate. I go on a lot of walks by myself.
Mm.
I do try to. I think I have developed the habit of just quieting my mind when I don't need it to be running for something, and just noticing what's going on. Just
Mm.
noticing if my hands are cold and not having to do anything about the fact that they're cold. Noticing what a glass of water tastes like as I'm drinking it. Just trying to pay attention to the very ordinary but also very extraordinary things that
Right.
being human entails. I think that's what meditation is trying to teach people to do. Some kinds of it anyway, but I don't have a lot of experience with it. I don't
Right.
think it's necessary.
I agree. Yes.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we can ruin it by making it a formality
Yeah.
in one way or another. I joke all the time that running for me is very meditative,
Mhm.
but I'm doing the exact opposite of what all the meditation people say you should be doing. Right? I'm letting my brain just go.
Right.
Right? I'm not. I daydream. I think about 1,000 different things, and I skip topics. Every 3 seconds, and I'm like,
Yeah.
and I that's some of my most productive thinking time because I put no constraints on it. I'm not trying to do anything. I'm not trying to
Mhm.
stop those thoughts. I'm not trying to, you know
Yes.
what I mean? I'm just experiencing them.
Right. I think that's the secret. It's just be who you are, and like don't judge it as little as possible,
Mhm.
because it's who you are. And if there's something that makes you uncomfortable about it, you can notice that without having to like beat yourself up.
Right.
It doesn't help. And since the vision quest, the spiritual journey for me has looked like recognizing what I mentioned earlier, that I am a part of reality, that I'm connected to it, which just gives me a perspective on myself that's not like I'm not a big deal.
Mm. Yes.
Like I'm just
Yeah.
this little thing here, just like all the other things. And man, all these other things are pretty cool. So I guess I'm pretty cool too. That's
Yeah.
that's good. That's good enough.
That humility can be freeing though,
Yeah,
right? Like, it's hard to be the center of the universe.
absolutely. Yeah, and actually that reminds me, you had your conversation with um, Leah Helbling,
Uh-huh.
and she was talking about her deconversion and how in a lot of her work now she talks to people who are really struggling with a lot of painful things, and her response to that was, well, I can't just put that on God anymore. And I was hiking when I
Mm.
listened to that. I remember exactly where I was in the trail, and it was just like my heart broke for her. I was like, oh, that's
Yeah.
so sad. And I think it's sad because it's not true, right? There may not be a God out there, but there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So, we're not responsible for all this. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
okay to recognize that we're not responsible for all this. So, again, I think that's that thing when people are talking about God and being able to put their cares on him, they're trying to talk about a real thing. They're trying
Mm-hmm.
to talk about that reality that we're very small, and we have a very small amount of control over what happens, and that's okay. That's part of being human.
That is absolutely the thing that I am trying to communicate. You mentioned in the email that you might be interested in talking about my conception of humanism,
Hmm.
and it is for me the embracing of one's humanity, embracing our frailties,
Hmm.
embracing our mortality, embracing our emotional hangups.
Yeah.
And the reason that I say that is that so much of religion is a denial of our humanity. And even some of my criticisms of the more Eastern influenced versions of meditation are similarly trying to reach a state that is inhuman, right? That only a few people are going to ever get to.
Right.
And I'm much more interested in what you've described, right? Going on a hike and thinking your thoughts and embracing that is your way of processing.
Yeah. I think of this as just to complete the story that kind of got me to what I'm about to say. I encountered Alan Watts was a huge revelation for me,
Mm-hmm.
in someone who talks about how everything is connected and we're a part of everything without that, what you just described, that kind of like, oh, I'm, just this disembodied aspect of reality and not really a human being.
Right.
Because he spoke about those things and he obviously understood them very deeply, but he also loved to get wasted with his friends and drop some acid and sleep around with a bunch of women. Like,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
like what a great teacher of what it means to be human, because we really do seem to exist on these two levels. On the one hand, we are a part of reality and we are connected to everything in real ways that have to do with actual matter and energy.
Right.
And on the other side, we are all by ourselves up here in our experience of being ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe other creatures are like that, but I don't know. All I know
Right.
is that is that I feel simultaneously connected and alone.
Hmm.
And that is part of being human. And yeah, like we don't want to run too far in one direction of everything is one and everything is fine and there's no suffering in the world and everything is how it ought to be. But we also don't want to run too far in the other direction of like, my experience is the most important thing
Right.
in existence. And I feel like the art of being human is in kind of navigating the tension between those two ways of being. And you can recognize that sometimes it's really helpful to be detached in your response to a situation. And sometimes it's really helpful to be very attached.
Right. Yes.
and and so
Yeah.
so both of them are just, again, I use the word tools a lot, but both of them I think are just tools that we can use to respond to the different situations that we encounter on a day-to-day basis.
I think that's honestly a profound insight, right? That we are simultaneously connected and
Yeah.
all alone.
Yeah.
And I sometimes use the analogy of, if the Vulcan mind meld existed, the field of psychology and religion would disappear, right? We have this deep, deep need to be known, to be understood. And for me, a lot of meaning making for me are these kinds of conversations. You and I are trying to be known to one another. And it is this process, as fragile as it is, as broken as it is, as incomplete as it is, that is meaning making, because we are discovering who each other are, and in the process, recognizing ourselves in each other.
Yeah, I think to look at conversations like this from both of the perspectives, from the perspective of like, I am interested in this conversation and I'm focused on it and I'm really preoccupied with the fact that I'm, trying to articulate these ideas
Yeah.
to you and trying to understand the ideas that you're giving. I'm experiencing it as an individual. But at the same time, I could step back and say, like, there's something very strange happening here, which is that the universe is having a conversation with itself.
Yes. Yes.
And that's
Exactly.
weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But it seems to be what's happening
Yeah.
from one perspective that I think is a valid perspective. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. Thank you for the privilege of
Absolutely.
experiencing that.
When you reached out to me, you said that you are interested in having important conversations. I forget which term you used, but
Sure.
you were trying to convey meaningful
Mm-hmm.
conversations.
Mm-hmm.
How, besides reaching out to podcast hosts, how do you do that in your life?
Oh man, what a great question. A lot of my time is spent thinking about answers to that question, and I
Yeah.
don't feel like any of them have been slam dunks yet.
Yeah.
The big thing that I work on every day is that I am writing a book. The current working title of this book is Reality Knows the Truth. And the subtitle, which I'm a little less in love with, is The Art and Artifice of Being Human.
Okay.
And my idea with this book is that it will act as an entry point into conversations like that. As a, I don't want it to be too long and complicated. I want it to be fairly approachable. But what I hope that it will do is attract people who are interested in these kinds of conversations, and I can start having them or curating them or connecting to the places those other people are already having those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and actually this is a part of this larger concern of mine, which is that I think that if we as a society, as a civilization, as a human community are not having these conversations on a regular basis, I think we're in danger. I think we're in danger of harming ourselves, harming the planet, obviously, and harming each other. I think that we do a lot of damage based on our attachment to the little things that are going on in our lives and in blowing them up in importance. And I'm far from smart enough to solve any of the huge problems that we have. But if solutions exist, they're going to be discovered by people having conversations like this one. That's what I think.
Very good. We haven't mentioned yet, and I'll be sure to promote this more in the intro, that you did about a year of a podcast called Dead Man's Forest.
Okay. Yeah.
And what I found fascinating about the quality of what you were capturing there is it almost has like an ASMR quality to it. You're out hiking, you can hear the birds chirping, you can hear the wind rustling, and you are just speaking out the thoughts that you have of back to your noticing your experiences. You're just describing these things. This is a very contemplative result that is fairly unique. I don't think I've run into anything quite like that. But tell me about that experience. Why did you want to do that?
I'm glad that you said those two things, that it kind of had this contemplative, almost ASMR feeling to it, because that is definitely something I was going for. And I'm glad that you said that it wasn't like anything else out there, because that's also what I was going for. Dead Man's Forest is the most direct result of the vision quest. I didn't have a vision, like what I would call a vision on my vision quest, but I did have a dream that I woke up from one night. And I don't often have dreams that I remember, and I extremely rarely have dreams that I remember and I know exactly what my subconscious is trying to tell me.
Right. Yeah.
And this one, I woke up. It wasn't even during the fast. It was, I don't even know if it was. I think it was after the fast. I was sleeping in my tent, back in the group of us, and I woke up and I saw a skeleton just sitting on a chair in the middle of this just wasteland, just lifeless, cracked earth wasteland. And in place of the man's head and heart, like kind of coming out of the neck of the Mr. Rogers cardigan sweater that he was wearing, was this tiny little beautiful green forest. And I immediately knew, I was like, this is me. This is my subconscious giving a warning to me that if I don't try to talk about the beautiful things that I think and feel, the thoughts that I have about how I experience reality and why that's important, if I don't plant those seeds in the wider world, then I'm going to die in this wasteland alone. And that's where Dead Man's Forest came from. It was really me trying to figure out, I think it was my first effort to do what you mentioned. How do I have conversations about these things? And if nothing else, I don't even know if I consider Dead Man's Forest to be a success or a failure. Not a lot of people have listened to it. I think in a lot of ways it's unpolished, and I'm okay with that looking back on it. But if nothing else, it was very therapeutic for me. I wanted to go to a place where I could talk without feeling like I was shut in a box.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I didn't want to build a podcast studio. That's kind of where the idea of the forest, of going
Yeah,
up to the woods, came from.
yeah.
And yeah, I think that I owe Dead Man's Forest the year I spent recording that every week. I owe to Dead Man's Forest my current ways of articulating things. And it's out there. I hope it's valuable to somebody. It's great if it is. I'm really glad that I did it one way or the other.
You are being self-deprecating, but like, not only do I think it's polished just fine, it has amazing sound quality. You and I talked last time, and you said that you were just using your phone's microphone, which I am just astonished by because again, it's just beautiful. The soundscape is just beautiful, and then again, you're just expressing the thoughts that you're having, and it has a very close and intimate feel to it. And anyway, I think it's
Great.
if you're into that kind of thing, it's a beautiful thing to experience. And so I recommend people check it out.
Yeah, there's something to be said for just putting some wind screens on your phone microphone, and
Yeah.
I mean, having the microphone right up close to your mouth is really valuable. Then of course you have to learn not to breathe into it. So there are some
Yes.
early episodes where I'm doing
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. In our previous conversation, you also had another astute observation, and that was talking about the propensity for very smart people to have very large blind spots.
Mm.
And part of what we discussed was the proper response to that is not, oh, look at how dumb that person is with their blind spot, but rather, wow, what am I blind to?
Mm.
Do you want to expand on that idea? And what have you discovered? Have you discovered any of your own blind spots?
Oh, what a great question. That's so hard to answer. I hope that in editing there is a sufficient pregnant pause here to give
Yes.
evidence to how hard I'm thinking about this.
We'll do that. Yeah.
I'll try to answer those questions in reverse, but I may have forgotten the first one by the time I finish answering the second one. Noticing my own blind spots, I think, happens most frequently. I think this is actually one of the enormous values of conversation,
Mm-hmm.
because I am most frequently thrust up against my blind spots when I am, like, especially in working on my relationship with my partner.
Mm-hmm.
Because so often I'm just forced to look at the fact that, for example, I've behaved really selfishly. That's a big blind spot I have. I'm pretty selfish.
Mm.
and by its very nature, I don't notice it when I'm doing it. I need other people to help show me that. And I need to, I really want to get defensive when it happens. And I really
Right.
want to say, no, I wasn't being selfish. But yeah, there was a situation recently where I did something selfish and my partner got upset and called me on it. And I was making dinner, I think. So I finished making dinner and thought about it. And as much as I wanted to wriggle out from under that,
Mm.
she was right.
Yeah.
And
as our partners usually are. Yes.
yeah. So I finished dinner and then I went and sat down next to her on the couch, and I was like, and I just said, like, this is what I did. It was selfish. I'm sorry. I'll try not to do it again. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, it was uncomfortable. I didn't enjoy it,
Yeah.
but I felt like it was the only way to get out of that discomfort and to be honest with myself and to honor my commitment to being her partner.
Mm-hmm.
And that too is part of being human, is you
Mm-hmm.
just get nailed to the spot sometimes.
Yeah. Yes. It is deeply uncomfortable to have your blind spots shown to you.
Yeah. Yeah. It is, but it's so uncomfortable, and at the same time, it is such a wonderfully rich opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to grow.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. What was the first question you asked?
I think that covers it. I mean,
Okay.
for me, for sure, I relate to everything you just said. You know, my wife can show me something, and my immediate response is defensiveness,
Yes.
and then, you know, 3 hours later, it starts to dawn on you. She's
Yeah.
making a good point, and how and just want to, you know, that's the human experience of discovering something about yourself. But I wanted to add on top of that that doing a podcast is a terribly dangerous thing
Oh yeah.
because my listeners, you know, and maybe Dead Man Forest listeners, and, you know, think of all the popular podcasts out there, hear hours and hours and hours of you talking. And I am certain that the observant listeners of mine are completely aware of all of my blind
Yeah.
spots.
Yeah.
And like you are putting some risk out in the world by expressing yourself, and especially for the length of time that a podcast does. So one of the things I want to say to the listeners is, you know, be gentle.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's risky, but it's also courageous, and you don't have to be better than anyone else to do
Mhm.
this. You know, like we
Right.
aren't. We're the same
Definitely not.
as everyone else.
Yeah. 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 Absolutely.
So yeah, and and the thing, I actually have this written down here, which reminded me. I guess it relates to the blind spots. I think it also relates to faith and doubt, which I wanted to talk about.
Hmm.
You know, in other more religious terms that I think have a human implication that is more interesting. Um, is that so many of us who have gone through deconversion did so based on, to some degree, the strength of our reason,
Hmm.
and that skepticism that we have is a very useful tool for discerning what's true
Hmm.
or what's likely to be true. But because we were so hurt by the loss of our faith and we felt so betrayed by the faith itself, we our very understandable human reaction to that is then to try and keep similar things at arm's length in the future. And we also use skepticism for that.
Mm. Yeah.
We use it to keep things at an emotional distance.
Yeah.
And you know, like all tools, skepticism can be useful or it can cut. It cuts both ways. And just to tie that into doubt, you talk a lot about the role of doubt in faith and how you felt that your doubt was a way to be honest with yourself and with others about what you really believed.
Hmm.
If it's really true, it doesn't matter how much you doubt it. Doubt
Right.
is doubt, 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 doubt. And in that way, I think doubt is evidence of good faith
Hmm.
when it's employed, when it's employed to try to get to the truth and not to try to keep ourselves at arm's length.
Right.
I think that's wonderful. I think that doubt is one of the most beautiful human ways of interacting with reality, because it is deep evidence that when I doubt because I believe that the truth is out there.
Right.
And that is is, funnily enough, I would not have said this when I was younger, but that is a kind of faith. I don't know that the truth is out there. I don't know that reality is real, but I believe it is.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's religion. The only word I have for it is spirituality. And coming back to the teaser that I dropped at the beginning of this episode, I now think of my deconversion that happened all of those years ago as just a kind of conversion. Because look at that word, conversion. All it means is a changing of one thing into another.
Mhm.
And that's what I've experienced. I'm not religious anymore. I'm not Christian. I'm not Lutheran, but I'm still human. I still have faith. I still believe things about reality. Why? Because I can't know them.
Yeah.
They're too big for me to know. And that is ever so meaningful to me, even though I don't think it's magical and I don't think it's supernatural. And I don't think that there's an eternal life after I die. But also, I don't know. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen no matter what I believe about it. Yeah. Because I wanted to talk about definitions, I think I wrote it in the email, right? There's almost a self-consciousness that when you or one of your guests uses a religious term like redemption or something like that, it's almost like, oh, that's a religious term. Like we're not supposed to use that. And I think it's like I simultaneously understand why that happens. And I also think it's unnecessary. I don't really think it's bad or harmful. It's just kind of like a self-conscious thing almost, or like a defensive measure on behalf of the people who are listening to the podcast who might have their own negative associations with those terms, maybe.
I can tell you what's going on in my mind. One of the things that I say often is that the most dangerous word in the English language is God.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is you can be, sitting in front of 1,000 people and you say something about God, and there are 1,000 different interpretations of what that means. And so I am hesitant, so for example, for me personally, I was never truly interested in a more liberal theology of, it's all about metaphor. And, it just because I was acutely aware that using that terminology would be interpreted in a different way by people of a theistic faith or a more literal faith, let's say. So there's two kind of competing thoughts here. On the one hand, I really like the way that James Croft recently said on Twitter. He was trying to convey this idea that the secular entails the religious.
Yes.
In the sense of what religion, as what we discussed earlier, as a collective search for meaning, is a human endeavor. It's something that we do, right? Like the theists are partly right that yes, religion is across all cultures at all times, for the most part, and that is because that's a human drive. But it's a natural one. It's a human one. So there's that aspect of it, and so. Like what James is saying, that the secular entails the religious, those words, like redemption, like grace, are human, are natural. And so I live in this tension of I'm redeeming religious words for natural humanistic purposes, but I am conscious that I, as a communicator, have the responsibility of how it is heard by my listeners. And so that tension is fascinating.
Yeah.
So that's the way I am approaching it, or what's going on in my head when I see those things.
Yeah, there is a tension there. And I think you got to exactly what my curiosity is, which is how much responsibility do you have? You can't reach into someone's head and turn the dial about how they understand a word based on their own experience. We can't do that. And so we have to, again, extend some level of grace to them.
Sure.
To say, it's your responsibility to wrestle your own understanding of reality out of your
Right.
experience of reality. Nobody else can do that for you because, as we said, we're alone in here. So yeah, I hear what you're saying, and we do need to be responsible about those things. I just don't know how far we need to take it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that's an impossible question to answer. Maybe that's just the art of communication.
Well, I will take that note as a
Yeah.
potential blind spot on my part. So.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me on how we use those terms. Yeah, I think because God, it's funny because I don't have a conception of God, but I have to translate other people's conception of God into my own conception of everything that exists.
Yes. Michael, this has been a fascinating conversation, truly living up to the idea of a good conversation, the kind of thing that I think you were, I hope that you feel the same.
Absolutely.
If people are interested in your work, the potential book coming up, and the podcast, Dead Man's Forest, how can they get in touch with you? How can they find your work?
Yeah, post a link to Dead Man's Forest for me, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a landing page with a preview snippet of the book that I put together, which I will send to you. People are also free to email me. My email address is mm@michaelmarvosh.com. And they can visit the projects page there too, and I'll give you the link to that as well. I'm always happy to hear from anybody who is interested in talking about reality and meaning and being human.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's been great.
Final thoughts on the episode. Okay, so I think you can see what I mean by a voracious curiosity. I hope you were not scared off by the use of the term spirituality. I know that when I first read about Michael's vision quest, I was a bit nervous about that. I wasn't sure exactly how that was going to come across. But when you get down to what he's actually talking about, it is much more about having humility, about recognizing one's place in the universe, about very natural things. And I think one of the things I really appreciated about Michael is that humility, is that sense of there's so much that we don't yet know and so much that we can learn. Michael had reached out to me to initiate a conversation before I knew anything about him. It took me a while to get back to him, and we had a chat before we recorded this. And I have to tell you that my initial biases about how that conversation was going to go was completely wrong. So I think Michael is a fascinating person. I am looking forward to reading more about his book. You can check out Michael's work on the podcast Dead Man's Forest, which is available wherever you get your podcasts. And then Michael is working on his book. He has provided a link for the book that is in progress. You can get a little preview there if you want to read that. And he also has a projects page on michaelmarvosh.com/projects. So you can see some of his writing, and that also points to the Dead Man's Forest podcast. I want to thank Michael for being on the podcast and for sharing his wisdom, the things he's learned in his life. I appreciate his curiosity. I thank him for a conversation that mattered. I definitely felt more inspired and more purpose, meaning, and connection after this conversation. So thank you, Michael. The obvious secular grace thought of the week is about that humility. As I mentioned, one of the scariest things you can do is have a podcast. I know you, the listener, know my blind sides much better than I do. And there's such an intimacy about podcasting. So I need you to know how much I'm aware of my own ignorance, how much I want to learn, how much I want to live up to Michael's curiosity. I want to continue to convey that to you. The secular grace thought of the week is that kind of humility is simple if you just are accurately understanding the vastness of humanity's ignorance and how much of the universe we don't know about yet. And that, I think, is the most exciting thing post-deconversion. Prior to deconversion, there were limits on what you were allowed to go investigate. The idea was that you already had the answer, and so there was no need to learn more. Now the world is open. Anything you are curious about, anything you want to learn about, you can go do so. I want to just thank all of you, the listeners, for continuing to write me emails. People like Michael reaching out to me to initiate conversations. That is what I get purpose and meaning from, is doing this work and connecting with you. Thank you for being a listener. Until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.